Hello and welcome. My name is Whitney and I'm an anesthesia intern documenting my journey as I go through my first year of residency. I just finished up my second week of emergency medicine, and in today's video I'm just going to be talking about that. First, I'll talk about what my week actually looked like in terms of scheduling and what the days looked like. Then I'll go into a bit more detail about the workflow of emergency medicine. I talked a bit about this in my last video, but now that I have another week under my belt, I feel like I can talk just a little bit more about the workflow and the workup while you're working in the emergency room. And then finally, as always, I will end the video by going over how many hours I worked this week. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so first to talk about my schedule for this week. So just as a reminder, during my emergency medicine block, it pretty much works out to where I'm working 4 shifts a week that are each 10 hours long. So last week I worked 4 days and my shifts started at noon and then went until 10 p.m. This week it's a little bit different. I still worked 4 days this week, but instead of starting at noon, I actually started at earlier in the morning at either 6 or 8 a.m., which I actually really preferred. I felt like with my shift starting at noon last week, it wasn't that big of a deal in terms of shifting sleep schedules or anything like that. But I'm more used to like working first thing in the morning or of the day and then coming home and relaxing. But on that shift last week, I almost had to do the opposite of it. And I had to kind of do my like relaxing slash like housework stuff in the morning and then go into work. And then I would just come home and then go to bed essentially. So it wasn't bad or anything. It's just not what I'm really used to. I'm much more used to these kind of earlier shifts that end earlier in the day. And I actually think I prefer it a little bit because I would just go, like wake up, go in, come home. And I actually had time to enjoy my afternoon. So I was able to like work out and study. I got to eat dinner with my husband every night, which was really nice. And yeah, it was just a little bit more of a schedule that I'm used to. Overall, I felt like it was a pretty good week, just because I really did like the schedule and I felt like I learned a lot. So that's really all I have to say about the week itself. So now I'll go into a little bit more detail about the actual workflow of the emergency room and what I'm learning while I'm there. So before actually going over the workflow of the emergency room and just what I'm picking up on, I'll first just start off by saying a couple things. First of all, I'll just start off by saying, I'm by no means an expert in emergency medicine. I did a rotation of it in medical school because it was required, and now I have done 2 weeks of it as an intern. So by no means am I like an expert, but these are just things that I've picked up during that time. I'll also say that, for me, I feel like the field of medicine I've had the most exposure to is internal medicine, just because there was a lot of emphasis on that when I was in medical school. And that was my first rotation of intern year. So I feel like that's what I'm most familiar with. So a lot of the times for me, I'm comparing emergency medicine to internal medicine. So it's hard for me to, consider emergency medicine completely by itself because I'm just so used to comparing it to internal medicine. But there's some similarities and there's some differences as well, and I just want to talk about those just because it's been surprising for me and I'm learning on the way, so I just wanted to share with you as well. Okay, so now for actually going more into the workflow of emergency medicine. So I touched on this in my last video a bit, but now I feel like I have a better grasp and understanding of what this actually looks like, so we'll talk about it now. So, to start off with, I'll start off by saying that when it comes to care in the emergency room, it kind of falls under two different types of care, I guess I could say. The first one I'll call just like emergencies, where there's actually like emergencies taking place that needs to be taken care of. The other type of care that patients receive in the emergency room is actually more of like symptomatic, right? So like someone comes in not feeling well and it's our goal to like help them feel better. So I'll talk about that in a second, but first we'll talk about the actual emergencies because under that heading, there's a couple different types of emergencies that I've come across. And again, I'm not an expert, but this is just what I've picked up this past week. So first of all, I think the first emergency that I can think of that's very evident to everyone are actually like life-threatening emergencies that need acute care. And in these kind of patients, sometimes you don't even need like a true diagnosis to figure out what's going on. The example that I saw of that this week is cardiac arrest, or when a patient's heart stops beating, right? So, like, these patients usually come in by ambulance because they're found like unresponsive outside of the hospital, and they're brought in, and it's very evident that they need something now so that they can be brought back to life, essentially. So in these patients, you're really just treating the emergency outright. Like, you're not really doing a workup of any kind. You see the problem, and it's your goal to fix that problem quickly. The next type of emergency is where I think a lot of emergency medicine is in. Is, you don't know if the patient has an emergency or not. You just know that they have a symptom. So patients don't come into the emergency room with like a diagnosis, like attached to them for us to see. They come in with symptoms and stories, and we have to base our workup based off of those symptoms and stories. So that's where I think a lot of the work of emergency medicine actually comes into, just because you start off with like the bare bones, and then your workup is super broad to figure out like what is going on with the patient. And from there, you're trying to figure out, do they actually have an emergency or do they not? Right? So that's kind of like the second group of emergencies that you see in the emergency room. You're just trying to figure out, like, do they actually have an emergency? And the third kind of emergency was kind of a new concept for me because I never thought about it in this way, but not every emergency is actually like a life threatening one, right? Like, there's some things, some symptoms we could say, where, if the patient doesn't have something treated right away, they wouldn't necessarily, like die from it, but their quality of life could really be impacted by it. So the things that we kind of talked about this week that could lead to that were like loss of vision, right? Like, if a patient comes in with some kind of eye concern, it's on the emergency department to see, like, okay, what kind of eye problem are they having? Not in terms of figuring out like exactly what it is, but is it an emergency where this person could lose their vision if it's not taken care of? We also saw things like threat of losing a limb, or even things like losing fertility, right? Like, there's some things where a patient's life isn't necessarily at risk, but the quality of their life could be at risk, or at risk for being impacted. And that was something that we saw quite a bit, actually, more than I was expecting to see. And it's not something that I thought of as like a true emergency, but now that I've gone through it, I can completely see how there's some things that just need acute treatment, and it's on the emergency department to figure out if they do need that so that they can preserve whatever it is that they are concerned with. All right, and then beyond that, it really is just symptomatic treatment is the other area of care that I saw a lot in the emergency room. So, like, if a patient came in and they thought they had food poisoning because they're like not able to keep anything down and they're super nauseous and they've been vomiting all day, right? Like, it's on us to, first of all, make sure that they don't have anything else going on, but then to make them more comfortable, right? To like help them control their nausea and vomiting. Usually these patients are like dehydrated, so we'll put an IV in them and give them some fluids just to make sure that they're staying healthy. And, like, once we have their symptoms under control, at that point, they usually just go home. And that happened quite a bit as well. I think nausea and vomiting were kind of the symptoms I saw the most, but we saw someone with like a headache. A couple of people did have like fractures or like broken bones. And for those people, as long as it was like something that didn't need orthopedic surgery right then and there, we usually just put like a splint or cast on them, or I should say just a splint. Of some kind, and then just made sure that they were comfortable and then sent them home. Okay, so that is what I've picked up in these last 2 weeks of working in the emergency room in terms of the goals of care, I guess you could say. So, like treating the emergency that is just like outright an emergency, like patients with cardiac arrest, working up symptoms to figure out if a patient does actually have an emergency, not only for things that are life threatening, but things that could threaten quality of life, and then symptomatic relief. Now, this is a little bit different, like I was saying before, to like internal medicine, because, in internal medicine, we kind of treat everything like acute and chronic, but in the emergency room, it's very acute focused. Yeah, acute, and it's very focused. So there were some times with patients where, once we figured out that they didn't have an emergency, we don't really go beyond that to figure out what they actually have going on, right? So, like, one example I have of this is we saw a patient with a rash this week, and it was a pretty bad rash, in all honesty. And the patient came in because it was just super uncomfortable for them. In terms of our emergency medicine workup, though, we're not dermatologists of any kind there. We really are just going to, or the emergency room providers are really just going to know about the rashes that can be an emergency, right? Because there are some rashes that can be kind of life threatening. So for the emergency medicine provider, they looked at the rash, and once they determined that it wasn't an emergency, wasn't going to cause any like long-term sequelae, at that point, we really just worked on making the patient comfortable and then sent the patient out. And the patient was kind of concerned because we couldn't tell her what exactly she had. But like I said, that's not really the role of a emergency medicine provider. That's more of the role of the dermatologist. In the emergency room, we're really just working on making her comfortable. And I think that was something that the patient wasn't expecting. And it was kind of hard for me to even say because it felt kind of strange being like, you're fine, like this needs to be treated, but there's nothing that we can really do for it here. And I'm just not used to that, but it is exactly what you're supposed to do in the emergency room. So just a shift from what I feel more used to in internal medicine of just like getting down to the nitty gritty and getting the answers. And I'm not saying that's like a bad thing. It was just like different than what I'm used to. And so that's just been an adjustment for me over these past 2 weeks that I'm getting used to. So that is what I have figured out over these first 2 weeks of emergency medicine in terms of the workflow and the goal when working in the ED or the emergency department. And I still have 2 weeks left, so let's see what else I can figure out over these next 2 weeks. I also want to share some good things that happened this week with a little bit of story time. And the purpose of me sharing this is I've come to the realization that, working as an intern, you really are doing so much. And sometimes I feel like when you're doing a lot, it feels kind of hard to know like if you're actually learning. If, to be quite honest, like I feel like I'm working really hard and I'm trying really hard as well, and sometimes it's just hard for me to know like am I actually like picking up things, am I learning, like every day is so hard, I don't know what I'm getting out of this. But I actually had a couple of things that happened this week that made me feel like, okay, I actually am learning. So I just want to share those really quick. The first one was, working in the emergency room. We had a patient who had a pretty bad fall, and they ended up not having like any broken bones or anything, but they had some pretty big lacerations on their arms, so like cuts. And it was a pretty gnarly cut, to be honest. It had like an angle to it, and then there was like another cut beneath it and another cut above it and like hanging skin off of one area. So it was pretty bad looking, but my attending had me go and like actually do the stitches for it. And I've done stitches before in the past, but this was definitely the one where I was like kind of unsure of what to do. But I just told myself, to like just get in there and do it, and I did it, and I ended up doing an okay job, my attending said. And it just felt really good because I don't know if I could have done that like a month ago. So I could tell that like my confidence is building up a little bit, which is really nice because I feel like a lot of the times I don't always have the confidence that I wish I did, but that little step kind of showed me like, okay, like I'm getting the hang of things. The other thing that happened this week actually has to deal with working with a nurse who had a question for me. And, whenever a nurse asks me a question, I never want to tell them the wrong thing. So I'm used to like going to my senior or going to the attending just to make sure that I don't say anything, like incorrect. But a nurse asked me a question that was actually kind of more of an important question. It wasn't something like, oh, can the patient have Tylenol, which that one's like always pretty easy to answer. But this nurse questioned or asked me if a patient that we were taking in was going to be under sepsis protocol. And sepsis just means like a really bad infection to where like your whole body is responding to this infection in a negative way. So like usually the vital signs are usually not in a good place. And it's pretty serious. Like you need to do interventions really quickly for these patients. And a nurse asked me if we were going to be doing sepsis protocol on this patient, and I knew exactly what to do. Like second nature. I just like looked at the vitals and like asked about the temperature, which are all like criteria for sepsis, and I was able to respond to the nurse's question quickly, confidently, and correctly because I did ask my attending afterwards just to make sure I was right, and they said that I was correct, that we were not going to be doing sepsis protocol on a patient. And I know this is such a small win, but I really, really don't think I could have done that a month ago. So it just feels good that I actually like was able to do something confidently and be correct about it. Um, just because I don't know, it just like showing that I am growing, and I know it's a small win, but I'll take whatever one I can get. And I'm just really excited that I feel like I am learning. It was like the first time I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm getting the hang of things. Both of these things happened on the same day this week, so I was having a pretty good day, to be honest. And I don't know, I was just really happy, and I shared it with my husband and my parents. So I don't know, it was really nice and exciting to see that I am growing. All right, well, that is all that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for following along as I talked about what I am learning in the emergency room and my first feeling of actually being a doctor, which is really exciting. As always, I'll go ahead and end the video by going over how many hours I worked this week. So I'll just pull them up here. All right, so just to start off with, I did have Sunday off, which is really nice. And then, yep, like I said at the beginning of this video, Monday through Thursday was when I was working, and I started earlier in the morning. So Monday 8 a.m. and I worked until 5:30, so a little bit less than the 10 hours. Tuesday I worked 6 a.m. to 4 p.m., so worked a full 10 hours, but getting out at 4 o'clock was really, really nice. Wednesday, again, working at 6 in the morning and then getting off a little bit early. Thursday, working almost a full 10-hour shift. But then I had Friday and Saturday off, which was really nice. So in total, I worked 38.5 hours. So overall, not a bad week at all. All right. Well, thank you again for watching. I will see you next time. Let's see, next week I am still in the emergency room, but I'll actually be working nights. So I will get back to you about how that goes. Take care, everyone.